growth area. Primarily, we decided not to do men and decided to focus on international instead. So it was seeing how the product needed to be changed to work for people not in the US, people in different languages, people with different interests and hobbies, and that's primarily what I spent my time on.
So how did you come to the decision not to focus on men? What data or what observations went into that decision?
Yeah, I think it's purely a market sizing exercise. So, there are, let's say, 100 million men in the U.S. that could use the product. There are a lot more women outside the U.S. than there are men in the U.S. So just in terms of market size, there's that. But I think the bigger component was as we started going into international, we didn't have as much of a female stigma as a female-only product in a lot of these other countries. So by expanding into international, you got both genders to use the product, whereas we already kind of had half of the US using the product and needed to do a lot of perception changing to get the other half to consider it. And that's not based on any issues with the product. It was based on men's introduction to the product, which was they followed their friends who were more likely female and saw female content because it originally was a more social following-based service instead of an interest-based service. So there's kind of all the men had been introduced to the product in the wrong way, and then you need to tell them try it again. Whereas this international, you could introduce them to exactly what their interests are, and then they're like, oh, this is for me, this is great.
Wow, that's really interesting. So Dan, same thing. Can you tell us a bit of background about where you came from, how you got started, and really what you dig into now in your role?
Yeah, so I have an engineering background. I worked on nuclear submarine design before I came to Silicon Valley. So just very kind of evidence-based. The way I like to sum it up is like we deal with reality, not just people's opinions or intuition. And so then when I came out here to go to business school at Stanford, I learned about product management as a career. And I'm like, that's exactly what I want to do. I asked everybody, where's the best place to learn product management? Because I didn't know anything about it. And they said Intuit. So I think Intuit was very formative.
Hey, let's shout out to our Intuit team.
Intuit.
Yeah.
Intuit was very formative because it wasn't nuclear engineering, but they were evidence-based. Like before we would build a product, we'd go out and talk to people, understand what their needs were and do divergent thinking and run a lot of different ideas by them to get evidence, right? And I think at the end of the day, experiments are just a way for you to design how to gain evidence that either supports or refutes your hypothesis, right? That's you're kind of just trying to generate evidence that's going to help you, get a more accurate view of reality, A lot of times they use the term reality simulators. Like product managers, we're reality simulators. Like if we go build this and we launch this, we should be able to predict like how much people are going to like it, who's going to like it, those kind of things. And then, that was, I was working on Quicken Software. We launched once a year. There wasn't a lot of instrumentation or analytics, but then I transitioned to an online team on Quicken.com. And then it was like we launched, and all of a sudden we had all this data. How many people signed up for our product yesterday? I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And the next day we had new data. I'm like, well, let's change this, and then we'll see what happens. So we had all this data. We sliced and diced. So that opened my eyes, as kind of a manager and getting a closed loop on the learning. Like, this is great. And so I've done a lot of both early stage, post-Series A, MVP, qualitative, getting product market fit work. I've also done a lot of analytics optimization and growth work. And the way I think about it, the three categories I use at a high level, I'm a big fan of Dave McClure's, R, startup metric for pirates, acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. I like to simplify it. Yeah, I like to simplify it. You can just simplify it and talk about acquisition, conversion, retention. In the early days of trying to get things right. And what I love, I think it was just like in the last week or two, someone posted a title that they said, growth is retention. Like they literally just said growth is retention. And when I give my workshops and talks, I always ask people in the audience, if you could focus on one thing, would it be acquisition, conversion, or retention? And I think the generally prevailing wisdom is, you need to nail retention first, because it's like this leaky bucket. If you can have the best, these growth hackers are just doing these tricks and getting people to come. You can trick anybody. I can make a landing page that makes you salivate and want to sign up for the product, and then you get in there and it doesn't meet any of those promises that I made at all, right? That's acquisition optimization. That's conversion optimization, actually. If I can get a lot of people there cost effectively, that's acquisition optimization. But retention rate really ends up being one of the key metrics. And so I think it's to optimize the ROI on your dollars and effort, you need to make sure retention is good enough before you focus on conversion and acquisition, basically. So that's kind of my general mantra on the order to do those things.
Love it. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because preventing the leaky bucket syndrome is a big part of what game thinking is about, starting with the core loop versus with onboarding, that sort of thing. So Casey, how did you deal with that? You know what we mean by the leaky bucket syndrome,
Yes.
right? So how do you think about that in terms of like, how do you prevent it? But then if you're dealing with that, how do you patch it? How do you fix it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to understand is what is the value that you provide to your users and what makes them experience that value and what makes them miss it. So, you know, we had a really high retention rate in the US, but when we started going international, our retention rates weren't as good and we didn't understand why. So I basically spent 2015 going to all these different countries, watching people use the product, and it was brutal. They basically,
Wow.
you know, they would sign up, they would get all American content, they would be like, "What is this shit?" And then it went further down from there.
Oh,
That's weird. They spoke English. They didn't get it.
Yeah. You know, so while every French person can speak English pretty well, they don't want to read English. They want to see French content, and we weren't showing it to them. And there were many other issues like that around the product. So we had to understand, like, okay, what is the value that we can deliver? What are these obstructions to value that are preventing people from getting to it? And then how do we systematically remove those? So we changed all the feeds to be in the local language that you sign up in. We made sure that things that were repinned only in France showed up instead of things that were repinned globally. We changed the word pin it to the French word for save, so people understood that that actually saved things for you.
Wow.
Things that are pretty obvious in retrospect, but we had to really watch users fail trying to unlock the value of the product to understand what holes we had to fix. And those things had massive impact on our retention, and they're not very difficult things to change, but you have to be able to spot where they are. And you know, in some products, you can do that by just watching your conversion funnel and saying, oh, people fall off on this page. You know, where do they fall off? Maybe I should change something there. But if it's a product that people go through and then they don't come back the second day, the only way that I found to really get a good understanding of what's happening is to watch a bunch of users go through it and fail, and then bring some hypothesis on how they can fail less.
let's talk a little about how you form those hypotheses. So we all know that to run an experiment that yields good data, you have to have a hypothesis up front.
Yeah.
And the crisper it is, the better. So like in this situation, how did you go about forming those hypotheses and surfacing them and then kind of prioritizing which ones you wanted to run experiments on?
Yeah, so basically after you know, a few days of watching, you know, French users, German users use the product, we all the people that were watching the research basically wrote on a bunch of sticky notes like what we saw the major issues being, and we kind of tabulated up the major themes that we were seeing. And from there, we tried to have an understanding of kind of the effort it would take to change that issue, the impact it would have on the user, and the percent chance that it would actually be successful. Because there's some things that, like, it's unlikely it'll be successful, but if it does, it's game changing, so you might want to try them. But we try to really focus on things at first that were very easy to implement and were, you know, likely to work and likely to have a big impact on our metrics. And essentially we were able to take all the ideas and create an ordered list there. And, you know, was that ordered list always correct? No, but it gave us a good starting point for which experiments to try and which hypotheses to validate.
There's a great point in there, which is that you don't have to get anything perfect. The whole process is very iterative. You make an ordered list that's not perfect. You don't sit there and like try and make it perfect. You say, let's go, and you get, the more data you get, the more experiments you run, the better you're then able to navigate through your list.
Yeah, in absence of any strategy, more experiments is better because you're getting more things out in front of the user to validate. And yeah, I mean, these estimations are t-shirt sizes. It's not like this is going to take 3 weeks. It's like this is medium or small, you know? That's the level of specificity that we went through because the main thing is to try to like move the ball forward, not to spend time trying to figure out the perfect plan first. You know, like a good plan violently executed today is way better than the perfect plan tomorrow. Yeah.
So what about you, Dan? How do you think about framing? How do you work with teams to surface and then frame and prioritize what they should test, what hypotheses they should test?
Yeah, so in my book, Lean Product Playbook, actually, I have 2 chapters on analytics. And so I have the lean product process that's in there that basically walks through what I've found in working with a lot of clients is it's basically like a maturity model when it comes to metrics or analytics or experimentation. Right? Level 0 is you have no idea. Like you know nothing, Jon Snow. You don't know what analytics are. You don't have anything yet. Level 1 is like you're aware, but you haven't yet instrumented your product yet. Level 2 is you've instrumented. You're starting to get some data. There's almost always what I call metrics hygiene issues. You think you're tracking one thing, but then you realize, oh, hey, our conversion rate's 120%. Wait, something's wrong here. So you have to like rinse and you have to get through all those speed bumps, and then you finally get to the point where you're like, okay, we know what our metrics are. We have baseline values that are accurate, that we have confidence in, right? And so I'm a big believer, and actually when I give my, one of the cases I give in my workshop, I'll show, I used to be the head of product at Friendster back in the day and optimize the viral growth there. And I put the loop up, and there's like 5 metrics. I simplify it again. I'm like, all right, let's pick 3. Everybody vote. Which one are you going to go for? And I just got done saying you need to get baseline values, and everyone votes. And they always vote for the one that's the worst, right? And I'm not steering them that way. Then I go, pink, and all the baseline values come up, and they go, oh, I'm like, why don't we re-vote? They're like, yeah. Just by knowing that this metric is at 85% versus this one's at 15%, not knowing anything about it, odds are the one that's 15%, you're going to be able to move the needle more, right? So one hack that I use is just what I call, what's the upside potential of a metric? I'm not saying we can move it all the way from 15 to 100, but gosh, chances are, not knowing anything, that metric's going to be easier to move the needle on than the one that's already at 85%. And there are different types of metrics. Those are percentage metrics. Sometimes you get metrics that aren't percentages. In the case of Friendster, the non-percentage metric was when somebody invites their friends, how many friends do they invite? And it was 2.3 when I was there, and like all the other metrics, the max is 100%. So I asked the audience, I'm like, I view metrics as dials. Like a dial has a gauge that has like a minimum value, a maximum value, and a current value. And I'm always like, and I put it up there. It's like 0, 2.3, and a question mark. I'm like, what's the max? And everyone goes, infinity. And I'm like, what's next? And they're like, oh, wait, how many people are on the earth? Okay, 6 million. I'm like, okay, then like, how many people on the internet? And they work their way down, but everyone starts out really excited because they know, wow, this may not have an upper bound, or it could be a really high upper bound. It's going to have more upside potential. So that's a quick hack, is just getting a baseline value gives you a lot of information. And then basically, once you've got them instrumented, identifying what your key metrics are. Another framework that I use in the book is the equation of your business. So Dave McClure's startup metric for Pirates is great at a macro level. The beauty of it is it applies to all businesses, right? Those 5 areas. And referral may not be as important for certain businesses like B2B or something like that. But if you're a viral game, it could be the most important, actually. Yep. But those 5 are a great way to think about what's the metric that matters the most right now for where I am, right? And as I said before, I think retention comes first, and then acquisition, or the conversion, or what he calls activation. I call conversion, and then acquisition. But basically, you want to look across. At some point, you need to come up with a quantitative way to express your particular business. And then I have a way of breaking down like profit equals revenue minus cost, breaking down the revenue component into like number of paying users times average revenue per paying user, and then further breaking it down. Like for SaaS businesses, churn rate ends up becoming a very important variable, right? Anyway, and then you look across those, you identify, your team forms a hypothesis about which one. You brainstorm all the opportunities you have to improve them and which one has the highest ROI. And then you go into that's at the global level. Then you go into a metric-specific loop, a learning loop, where you say, great, now we want to improve this conversion rate. What are all the ideas that we have? And form a rank ordered list, like Casey was saying, and start to execute. And what I like to have this little loop, what I like to say is when you go through the loop, you brainstorm your idea, you design it, you launch it, you see what happens. You hope the metric goes up and to the right, but even if it doesn't, you win because you learned.
Yes.
You learned not to do what didn't work. And the whole point is not just to move the needle, but to learn, right? There are plenty of examples out there where people are changing colors of buttons and making them bigger, and they eke out a few percentages, but they didn't learn much of anything, right?
So the high learning experiment. So let's talk a little bit about managing risk. A lot of running experiments, especially early in your product development, is about managing your risk. Later on, when you've got a product that's going, and you're doing these kind of things where you're looking at the different dials you can turn. But before you're at that stage, you run experiments to really scope, right, and to manage risk. So how do you think about this, Casey? Especially now, Casey is now at Greylock, so he advises Greylock's portfolio companies on growth. So like when you're working with these companies, how do you help them identify the experiment that's going to really help them learn about the risk that's important versus the experiment that might be a lot easier to run but isn't surfacing as much important stuff?
Yeah, I think going back to Dan said, it's really about understanding like what the growth model looks like and what types of things are having an impact on the model. So something that I like to do is actually break down what's the change in like new users coming in, what's the change in like returning users, resurrected users, to try to see if like your metrics are going in different directions. Which group do you need to actually improve on? And for one startup that I was working on, everything was pretty healthy, retention was good. It's just all of a sudden new users had went down a lot. And this can happen, especially for games or apps where a rise in the App Store charts can all of a sudden get you a lot more new users, but you don't stay up there. So they had seen kind of a rise in the App Store, a lot of new users. Those new users connect with friends, which brings a lot of other people back, but they didn't kind of stay up there once their particular demographic had some holidays and whatnot. And then they're like, oh, our metrics are down. We don't understand what happened. So the first thing is understanding kind of what part of the funnel needs to be improved, and then brainstorming like, are there specific opportunities that can help fix that part of the funnel or move it upward? And hey, if you're very early on, you don't have like an A/B experiment tool that you can use, so you just change something and you look at the pre-post and you see if things are back on track. And then once you get more data, you invest in running an A/B experiment where you only show a portion of people that new flow, and then you see enabled versus control. Are you seeing a statistically significant difference? And people are investing in the experiment frameworks a lot earlier than ever before. And in the case of these companies, even though they're a few months old, they might have gotten like 1 million DAUs or something because they went super viral. So they actually have statistically significant data pretty early. But when they don't, we just flip the dial, and if things go down, then you flip it back as soon as you can. And you have to decide, if how big a change you're comfortable making. Usually I advise the early stage startups, like you want to go for massive changes because you're looking for massive changes in your metrics. If you flip something and then you can't tell a difference between pre and post, you probably weren't aggressive enough in terms of the experiment you tried to do. And then later on when you're Pinterest stage, yeah, you get a 1% change and you're excited, right? But a 1% change, at a seed stage startup, you can't tell that anything really actually happened.
Well, I took your question as actually like pre-launch even, it sounds like, right? Like
Well,
basically, you don't even have any, it applies everywhere. I think the key there is you got to be really crisp on your hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
Because there's no like hypothesis Bible or template you just follow. Right? There's advice out there and things like that, and that's why in my book, for how to achieve product market fit, I have very specific things that you need to get right. You need to get clear on who your target customer. I know we see eye to eye on this, making sure you're really clear on your target customer, and that those are the people you're talking to. It all starts with them. And the next thing up is kind of what Casey was saying about how you're creating value. I focus on like what are the customer benefits or needs that you're attempting to provide value with, right? And this is where it gets into not doing feature speak and solution-based stuff, but problem-based thinking and getting really clear. And then finally, the last piece is, two pieces. One is of those needs, which ones are underserved? Like some of those needs may be very well served today by what they're doing, and you're not able to come up with a way to be better or different and provide more value. And the final one is your value prop, where you get crystal clear on, okay, for these benefits, here's how we're going to provide more value for that target customer. So articulating your hypotheses in those ways before you go out and do customer discovery interviews or before you go out and actually share prototypes to get feedback, that's basically helpful. And I think the good rule of thumb too is, you should define what success or failure for the experiment is before you run it, because human nature is always like, oh yeah, we got 20% bump. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Ahead of time, if you'd ask people, they were looking for a 200% bump, right, or whatever it is. Or 5 out of 10 people need to say they like it. 5 out of 10 is fine, but ahead of time, you never would have settled for that.
Yeah, one of the things that we did at Pinterest very religiously is we had to write an experiment doc about what the hypothesis was and what the expected changes were, positive and negative. So it might be your metric moved up, but a secondary metric moved down a lot, in which case the experiment is a failure. So basically the entire team working on that had to approve not just the experiment that it looked correct, but the experiment doc. Are we crisply writing what we expect to happen and what kind of levers allow us to say, hey, we want to ship this thing versus this is a failure? And I think it's super critical to be honest prior to launching the experiment with that. And build that habit early on.
Great. I could keep going forever. This is fascinating, but oh yeah.